There is so much going on in Syria after the collapse of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But what's the one thing we should be keeping our eye on in the next couple of days?
They will be bent on trying to undermine HTS because they are sworn enemies. They hate HTS.
And why is Israel now bombing parts of Syria as well? We'll find out why and lots more on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we will head over to Westminster shortly to find out some of the UK angles to what's been happening in Syria. But obviously, the big deal with the news is what's happening in Syria itself. And there's kind of two big strands there today, I think. One, the developing interim government under HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, that group from the northwest of Syria whose lightning military action took down the regime of Bashar al-Assad to everyone's surprise. And then the second thread is how other countries are responding, particularly Israel, which has launched some military action of its own in Syria in the wake of the collapse of the Assad regime. So there are lots of dots to join, and I'm joined by two people who are very good at doing that. Here in the studio with me is BBC diplomatic correspondent James Landale. Hello, James.
Hello, Adam.
Busy couple of days?
Very busy couple of days. I'm just back off a plane from Bahrain, where I've been at a conference.
And this all unfolded while you were there.
While we were all there, yeah. So it was all sort of happening. So this is the conference it's called the Manama Dialogue, run by the IISS, a London-based think tank, which is a sort of regular thing. And so lots of key figures from the Gulf there, and of course it was all happening, while we were there, and that sort of sense of stunned, jaw-dropping moment was visible as people wandered around going, "Crikey, has that really just happened?"
Was there anyone who had seen it coming and said that, and you believed them?
I have yet.
You don't have to name any names. But...
No, I think everybody was pretty realistic. That I think. Look, if you look at all the constituent parts, you can be aware of that. But as is often the case, everybody says autocracies and dictatorships are in place until the moment they're not in place.
Yes.
And knowing when that moment's going to happen is incredibly hard to sense.
Well, somebody who had an inkling, but she's far too modest to say that she predicted it, is our colleague from BBC Monitoring, Mina Al-Lami, who's one of the Jihadist Media Specialists. Welcome back.
Hello. I'm sorry to disappoint you. We didn't have an inkling either. I don't think, I don't think even HTS anticipated...
The group that they brought down Assad.
Exactly, the militant group that brought down or that led the offensive. I don't think they knew that they were going to eventually take over most of the country. On the 27th of November, they started with the declared aim of advancing in Western Aleppo, not even the whole of Aleppo, but Western Aleppo. And that expanded to, so the forces have collapsed. Let's go on and take Aleppo, neighboring Homs, and then Hama. And then, as the government forces started to wobble, other rebel groups joined up and they thought, well, this is possible. Let's all kind of join this collective. And in previous months, they didn't really show a lot of, what to expect, of course, for security reasons. So, yeah, it was really difficult for us even, closely following to anticipate an offensive of that scale.
And so they certainly didn't have an interim government of Syria ready to go, did they? They're having to sort of cobble that together now, and one of their guys is going to be the interim prime minister for a few months.
Yeah, but they definitely didn't have, I think, the speed with which this all happened. As you said, they didn't expect to have a prime minister, and they've simply reappropriated the existing prime minister that HTS has in that small enclave in Idlib. So they've set up a government that's been running in Idlib since 2017. HTS kind of leads behind the scenes. It's a front for HTS. They have a prime minister who's now been, appointed as the interim minister of all of Syria.
Mohammed al-Bashir.
Mohammed al-Bashir, yes. He's an engineer, and he used to be the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs 22-23 for the HTS government in Idlib only. And it was only earlier in the year, and actually January, because every year they change the prime minister, there's elections, so they're always trying to kind of bolster their image as a very legitimate group capable of governance, but also they don't hold on to the seats. They always change. They always call for, feedback. And, what do you think about this minister, about this group? They have a department of grievances to kind of lodge complaints against HTS itself and kind of give it feedback.
Fascinating to see that model sort of being expanded across the country. James, I thought we could just do a little tour around the world about how other countries are dealing with this. I mean, that could take hours and hours and hours, so we'll only do a few countries. But can we start with Israel? And there's kind of two kind of bits of Israeli action here. There's some Israeli action in the Golan Heights, where you have to give us a bit of a history lesson to understand that, and then actually further into Syria itself. So just explain the Golan Heights and what's happening there.
I think it's fair to say that the Israelis, like many countries, are using this transition, this uncertainty, this hiatus, to do a bit of housekeeping and make the most of what they can. So what we've seen the Israelis do is they have been taking a little bit more territory in the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is an area of near northern Israel, part of southern Syria, which has been occupied by the Israelis for many, many years. It is not recognised internationally. It's not a place you will find British ministers going. But essentially, it is a bit of Syria that was seized by the Israelis to prevent a future Syrian invasion of Israel. So heavily militarized, heavily disputed.
And that's going back to 1967.
Oh, yeah. No, this is going back a long time. And so what has happened, though, is that in the last few days, the Israelis have taken a little bit more territory, largely territory abandoned by the Syrian armed forces. The Israelis say this is, protection, buffer zone. This has provoked some criticism externally from people saying, no, this is the Israelis, again, trying to change the military situation on the ground. Elsewhere, the Israelis have been targeting Syrian military bases. They've also been trying to target what they believe are chemical weapons storage. Remember, there's a
history of those weapons
being used by the Assad regime. And so, in other words, that's taking place. The risk is this, and this is the criticism that's been leveled back at the Israelis, is that there's a risk of them upsetting the apple cart. That at a time of huge sensitivity, instability, uncertainty, just as you've got a new sort of power trying to establish itself, how it's going to do that, the Israelis are depriving it of its military force, potentially its ability to secure the country. And so that's the criticism that's been made. So the Israelis are saying, look, we're shoring ourselves up. We're taking out those bits of the Syrian army that have potentially could be used against us. But the criticism is that it's destabilizing. The thing to understand, though, is that, the Israelis and Syria has been part of the anti-Israeli conflict for a long time. The Iranians have used parts of Syria as a base from which to attack Israel. So, it's been part of this war for some time.
I mean, I was going to put that point to you, that actually Syrians have had to get used to, over the last few decades, being a sort of chessboard for everyone else, whether it's Kurdish fighters, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Russians, whether it's Americans. There are a lot of people who have gone in there over the last few decades.
Absolutely. And this is, I think, one of the key challenges that this new authority will face, is because it has been kind of grounds for proxy wars for different groups. And for years, actually, this is, HTS being able to get all rebel groups on board has been a game changer in terms of its ability then to push through. I mean, everything happened so fast, and all these groups were on, they had the same goal, which was to topple the government of Bashar al-Assad. So at that point, and everyone wanted to be part of that, that winning party. And everyone was happy. Genuinely, everyone wanted to come on board. But it's now, as things kind of settle, and it happens so fast, as things settle and they start to kind of picture or form the current, the next step. What will the government look like? What kind of government? Will it be kind of dictatorship? Will it be an Islamist government? Then you'll see that tug of war. Then you'll see these rivalries come to fore. And it's not just the rivalries, the external groups to HTS. It's also within the ranks of HTS itself. I mean, it is an Islamist group, but the leader and the inner circle, they're quite, they're pragmatists, and they have been for years trying to prioritize development and reconstruction and trying to placate adversaries, existing ones, future ones. And they're doing that now, telling Iraq, Jordan, Russia, China, we want to be friends. We want to be a stable country. And even with the Israeli airstrikes yesterday, the government, HTS, the officials, they didn't say anything. There was nothing on their official channels, even though some hardliners, not within the group, but within that scene, were saying, you have to, you have to be strong, you have to show defiance. They have been playing the long game, and they know, they're trying to avoid the pitfalls of traditional global jihadist groups like IS and Al-Qaeda, who have that bravado, take on the West, challenge the West. They, that invites retaliation they cannot, confront. And so they've seen these groups get crushed. Jolani is a veteran of those groups. They've seen how they got crushed, and I think they're trying a completely different strategy now.
Just looking at our list of countries we need to sort of think about, what does this mean for Iran? Because all the commentators are saying, oh, this is another kind of a blow for the Iranian regime, proof that they're not as strong as they liked to project themselves as.
Yeah, I mean, this was a key part of the arc, the axis that Iran operated through. It's not just a physical loss. I mean, Syria was part of the physical territory through which Iranian missiles were delivered to Hezbollah in Lebanon. These missiles, which are still, many of them, aimed south towards Israel. So it's lost that. So the
geography was as basic as that. It's like missiles just went by road through Syria, and that's how they got to Lebanon.
Yeah, they can't. It's sort of it's harder. This is one thing we always forget. Israel is a long way away from Iran, and Iran. There's a sort of geographic thing here, and so there's a loss there. There's a loss of part of the whole idea that Iran exerted pressure and power and influence in the region through its proxies. So in the last year, we've seen its proxy in Gaza, Hamas, heavily degraded. We've seen its proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, heavily degraded, and Hezbollah was the great it was the tool of deterrence. The one thing that was going to stop an Israeli attack or its stroke invasion of Iran was the threat of missiles from Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon. That is now diminished in a way. Syria was part of that that arc of influence that the Iranians had. It's hugely damaging for the Iranians. It's another setback. And so you have a government now in Iran that is weakened by foreign policy setbacks, but also by internal economic threats because its economy isn't doing great at the moment. And you've also got a very, very strong, robust debate now within Iran about the social side of stuff in terms of, legislation that's coming up at the moment that's going to put yet more pressure on women to wear the hijab in certain circumstances and the penalties if you're not wearing, of which now is, there's a real debate about. So Syria is another sort of chunk out of the sort of Iranian armory, and the government in Tehran is definitely on the back foot.
And what about the US? We're in this weird in-between period where we've kind of got like two presidents at the same time. Okay, Joe Biden's the only actual sitting president, but Donald Trump is pretty much acting like he's already there.
Exactly so. And the tension is this. Donald Trump says in a tweet or on a message on whatever platform he's on at the moment, this is not our war, this has nothing to do with us. Ignoring slightly the fact that there are about 900 US military personnel in the east and the northeast who are there to support Kurdish allies fighting. IS, you'd know far more about the detail of this. So there are US military personnel on the ground, and they are doing a very, very important job of helping the Kurds keep a lid on IS to varying degrees of success. And the risk is this. The risk is that the Turks use this opportunity to press their advantage against Kurdish forces in that part of Syria that the Turks consider to be terrorists and linked to their own PKK group.
And which the Kurds say is basically their homeland,
their homeland.
Be a country.
If the Americans, in any way, under Donald Trump, America first, pulls troops out, then that means that all these Kurds who at the moment are guarding an awful lot of prisons packed full of jihadis and people linked to jihadis, they have to go off and fight. So suddenly these prisons and detention centres are no longer guarded. That means they can break out, and suddenly you have, potentially thousands of people who have some link to, IS.
Including potentially maybe some British people
Yeah,
who went to go join the Civil War
exactly.
and hooked up with
they are
some of
they're there. I mean, the Brits have been criticised in recent years by the Americans for not taking the British nationals out of those camps. Some other European countries have started doing that now after a lot of pressure from the Americans. But the British, they've taken some unaccompanied children, but there are still jihadi wives and others who are there. And the Kurds and the Americans have been saying for a long time, you've got to deal with this issue. But at the moment, there are American forces there, so it's an American issue.
So many things to think about. Mina, just give us a kind of pro tip for the next few days of something to look out for or watch or wait for that will be just quite important. I mean, it's all important, obviously, but there's a lot of moving pieces. Just pick one of them.
I think I would, just picking on James's point, is really about IS or ISIS, because they are getting very excited about two things. One, the prospect of weapons depots from the defeated government forces who left, and there's a lot of messages on their messaging apps is just like stock weapons, grab whatever weapons that you can, but also really excited about the prospect of prisoners. The prison breaks already, so there have been a number of prison breaks in Homs and in Daraa. So already you can see them getting excited and saying X, Y, and Z has left, and then others shushing them, saying, "Oh, don't share this kind of information." But of course, the prize, they will have their sights on the camps that are holding IS-linked families, Al Hol and Al Roj and Hasaka, which is controlled by the Kurds, but also the prisons that are holding the men, Ghouairan, which they actually did raid and break into in 2022. So it has been in their leadership messages. The prisons and the camps have been a top priority, and they have repeatedly said, we have to break through these prisons. We have to free the prisoners. So I think that's it. But they will be bent on trying to undermine HTS because they are sworn enemies. They hate HTS.
Well, I was going to say, does that then lead us to basically a second Syrian civil war where it's HTS versus them?
It won't be as much as a civil war because they're still a small group. And IS hates everyone, all these other groups. So it doesn't have a partner. It doesn't have allies. It's on its own, and it has an ultra-violent message, and it's just not sustainable, and it's not compatible with any of these groups. So I don't think IS will, but it will be, what it will try to do is destabilize any potential stability, security. It's done the same in Afghanistan. Not to say that the Taliban's rule has been great, but that is what they tried to do in both cases. They said the Taliban in Afghanistan and HTS, IS did issue a message saying they are apostates, they are sellouts, and they have to be fought.
Okay, worth watching. James, just a philosophical point to end on, and it's a bit navel-gazing because it's about the media, but do you think we should have seen this coming? I know we started off by saying you were at that conference and no one saw it coming, even the professional diplomats and prime ministers of countries neighboring Syria. But is there something about what we look at and what we don't look at that we need to look at?
Look, hindsight is a great thing. I think the media as an industry, we're pretty bad at predicting things, election results and, what's going to happen with things like Brexit or whatever. I think what we have to do, what I think we probably should do as an industry, is keep more tabs on different stories so that we're watching the pots boil, so that we don't become too monofocused and just focus on Ukraine when that's hot as a story, or just Israel-Gaza when that's hot as a story, or just even Syria when it's hot as a story. We should just keep an eye on all of those conflicts in the same way that we need to keep an eye on what's happening in Sudan, which is bigger than almost all of these things in terms of the sheer numbers of people who are suffering there. In the same way, we should keep an eye on the political uncertainty in Georgia that's taking place. Protesters are still out there on the streets. You've got a government in Romania where the first round of the elections has just been annulled by the courts because of alleged Russian interference. In other words, there's a lot of stuff going on around the world, and it's not just, let's wait for Donald Trump and what might he do when he gets into power. And I think it's incumbent upon us as the media, I don't use the word mainstream because we're all in it together, to just keep a tab on these things so that when a story sort of goes from warm to hot, it's not a complete surprise to our audience. So I think what we should have done is done a little bit more coverage of the fact that this war in Syria has been still going on for a very, very long time without necessarily having to predict, as if we're soothsayers.
Yeah.
It's going to fall tomorrow.
It's just that weird dichotomy we have of we're always, as journalists, being accused of only focusing on like the new and the exciting, but actually sometimes as a professional class, we don't have the imagination to imagine the new thing that's going to happen. So both those things are true at the same time.
We are able to do it because we are legally obliged to do it, at least here in the UK, when it comes to court cases. We have to report fairly on the prosecution and on the defence and give fair balance to both sides, and then give the outcome when we get the verdict. And we're legally obliged to do that. In other words, we can't just focus on the sexy stuff. We have to give broad balance. And I think that approach, obviously not through the legal sense, might improve our broad coverage when it comes to these global issues.
And can I just on that, I know it's...
Are you going to plug your podcast that you've
I
been
am
doing for 2 years about all of this
I
stuff?
know, I'm going to plug that podcast. No, but I think...
Which you'd be allowed to do, by the way.
I'm not, of course, not to say that we saw this offensive on this scale coming, but we have been... One of the things that we do at BBC Monitoring is that we look at events closely over a very, long period of time, actually never look away, even when things become boring and, groups become a bit, boring, but we continue to look at it. And one of the, when we did that podcast, The Global Jigsaw, zooming in on HTS and the government it had in Idlib, and let's look at Jolani, look at his transformation from this jihadist leader to kind of almost like a rebel statesman. And we did a deep dive. I mean, that was part of looking at the trends, looking at the changing narrative and the rhetoric as Jolani stopped talking about jihad and Sharia, and he was talking more about, development, ministries and the revolution. And they're, they...
Well, as you said yesterday, he even changed his clothes.
So we do really look at these small... we look at these kind of, these changing narratives. Even when we look at messages, we're looking at the language, we're looking at the logo and the branding and changes in that. So, but we do have within the BBC, we are looking. So just
and we are so lucky to have them.
Yes.
Because no other media organisation has the scale and the depth and the knowledge and expertise of monitoring. And that's why, I would urge all mainstream editors of sort of main, news bulletins in the UK and elsewhere, follow monitoring.
Well, Mina, thank you very much.
Well, that's great. Better than I thought.
He did the plug for you.
He did.
And James, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Right, now let's go to Westminster to find out what the British government response to all of this is and whether there are some implications for life here in the UK. We can chat to Chief Political Correspondent and friend of Newscast, Henry Zeffman. Hello, Henry.
Hi, Adam.
The whole world was kind of blindsided by what happened in Syria over the weekend. Do you think the government was as blindsided as the rest of us?
Probably not much less blindsided, yeah.
What sort of vibes were you getting over the weekend as they were sort of getting their heads around it?
Well, there's an interesting element to this, which is that speaking to people in government about how they're responding to this, no one denies the global significance of it. They are as gripped and fascinated and eager to understand what's going on and what's going to happen as the most dedicated newscaster. But unlike some world events, the UK really is not even close to the heart of this. Of course, the UK is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That confers upon the UK Prime Minister an outsized role in global affairs, and there's all sorts of other things about our role in NATO and as a global power and historic colonial power and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in that context, this is not one that the UK Prime Minister is massively at the heart of. But in some ways, that makes it a bit more strange, actually, because Keir Starmer is expected to pronounce on it, but he's not expected necessarily to do much. So the sense I get from people in government is they are watching, responding as and where they need to, and there are specific things that the UK government has to make a call on. But basically, watching, glad that Assad has fallen, but cautious about what comes next.
But isn't it amazing how different that is from 2014 when David Cameron was Prime Minister and there was that vote in the House of Commons about whether there should be British military action against Bashar al-Assad after he'd used chemical weapons. And Labour and Ed Miliband voting against that and the vote not going through then meant that no country, even the US, took military action against Assad. So actually there was a time when Britain was right at the heart of what was happening in Syria.
Absolutely. And that is something that, as I've just been almost making small talk with MPs as I do over the last couple of days, and Syria has come up, that is something that MPs of both parties do keep talking about. Many of them see that as a historic, though nevertheless very significant example of how inaction in military terms can have consequences just as action can. And it is something that as many Labour MPs as Conservatives that I've spoken to would quite like Ed Miliband, now the Energy Secretary, to be asked questions about. I'm not sure anyone has had the opportunity since Sunday, but Ed Miliband, of course, was leader of the Labour Party at the time and made that decision to vote against the government. By the way, there would be people, we should stress, who still think that was the right thing to do. I suspect Ed Miliband still thinks that's the right thing to do. One of the many reasons it'd be interesting to hear his take. And, if you want to get really niche, Ed Miliband's then Shadow Foreign Secretary, Douglas Alexander, has spent most of the intervening period as a private citizen, but is now back in government, back in Parliament, back in politics, and a trade minister in Keir Starmer's government.
That's a little trip down memory lane. You talked about specific things that the government is doing. And on Monday night, we got the news that they were going to pause processing for asylum by people from Syria. What does that actually mean? It seems it's a sort of simple thing to say. I'm not sure what actually it means in practice in our system.
Well, I think it means that for now, at least, Syrians will not be granted asylum, as in a decision will not be made on applications by Syrians who are seeking asylum. And that's for actually the fundamentally simple reason that Syrians seeking asylum in the UK at the moment, and for much of the past, decade and more, would have been doing so on the basis of claims about what would happen to them if they were in Syria under the control of the Assad regime. The Assad regime is no longer. Therefore, the circumstances in Syria have changed. Therefore, the ways in which those asylum applications might be assessed, and I guess in some cases applications might be withdrawn, have changed. And the UK, by the way, is not out on a limb here. The UK government made this decision after a handful of other European countries did similar. So I think it's just another symptom of how the UK specifically and many Western powers more generally are a bit surprised, though not unpleasantly as they would see it, by what's happened in Syria, and are just waiting to see how things develop.
Yeah, and in terms of Syrian asylum claims, and specifically the small boats arrivals, I just thought I'd check to see the numbers, because in my mind, loads of people arriving on the small boats across the English Channel were from Syria, but actually it's about 7.6% of the small boat arrivals are from Syria, so a lot more from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. But back to the asylum system, Syrians who were arriving on small boats in the last 5 or 6 years, 99% of them got asylum, presumably because the system judged that the situation in Syria was just too dangerous for them to return to, and it was maybe quite an easy decision for the system to make. Also, just one other Syria-related thing: HTS, the group that whose lightning raid on Damascus kind of brought down the Assad regime. It seemed there was a bit of confusion on Monday about if the government was going to review their status, because at the moment they're what's called a proscribed organisation. Basically, they're officially labelled as having terrorist links by the UK government.
Which means that anyone in the UK expressing support for them is therefore falling foul of the law, but also imposes various sort of strictures on contact with them. But there's a world in which they become the sort of established government of Syria, in which the UK government would then want to have contact with them, at least of some sort. Yeah, you're right, Adam. It was a bit confusing. So on Monday morning, Pat McFadden, who is a cabinet minister, a senior cabinet minister, and actually, his main job is, on Monday morning, he was out there talking about civil service reform, but he'll be involved in decisions here. He sits on the National Security Council. That's the sort of elite group of cabinet ministers who decide government policy on the most important foreign and security issues. He was asked about whether that prescription would be lifted, and he suggested that a decision would be made there fairly rapidly, would need to be made there fairly rapidly. Then later in the day, Keir Starmer, who by coincidence was on a trip to the Gulf, meant to be about trade, although he ended up publicly at least answering questions about this, Keir Starmer suggested that actually a decision was not that imminent. That now seems to be the settled position of the government. So, look, there may well be a call for the government to make here before long, but I don't think they're making that call anytime soon.
And it sort of sums up the whole world's dilemma about HTS in that they've got a past, which some people would say is terrorist related, or some people might describe as extremist. But equally, the world is as it is now. Syria, this is what's happened in Syria. So governments around the world are going to have to weigh up the pros and cons of dealing with them. Right, let's talk pure domestic politics. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has been super busy the last few days. She was in Brussels on Monday, being the first UK minister to attend an EU meeting in ages. I mean, bearing in mind, a few years ago, they would be there, sat around the table in their own right as a member. And also today, she's launched the spending review, which is the potentially quite tough negotiations between the Treasury and the other government departments about their budget for the next few years. What's your take on just the start of that process?
This does not, I admit, Adam, sound box office to start off with. A spending review. Not just a spending review, a multi-year spending review. Not just a multi-year spending review, but the first zero-based spending review for 17 years,
which is the most exciting kind of spending review.
Well, right. So all of that I can see as a recipe for people's eyes to glaze over, but they should not. This is a really, really massive deal for a few reasons. So this is going to determine the resources for every government department right up to mid-2029, or in other words, the next general election. So it tells us a lot about the political priorities of the government. It also, just as people living in the UK, though obviously not all newscasters live in the UK, will shape our interactions with the British state, because Rachel Reeves and her deputy Darren Jones, in negotiation with their fellow cabinet ministers, are going to make a series of decisions over the next few months about what the state should do, can afford to do, can do well, and almost more importantly, what it can't do or shouldn't do. Because Rachel Reeves' language gives you a clear sign of how tough she intends this spending review to be. In the sort of Treasury press release that came with this, she said, "I said I would have an iron grip on the public finances, and that means taking an iron fist against waste." So apart from every bit of Rachel Reeves' body seeming to be made of iron, I think what it tells you...
Other metals are available.
Well, not in the Treasury press office. What it seems to tell you is that Rachel Reeves wants departments to find what are, semi-euphemistically are known as efficiency savings. We're told, up to 5% over the period. That means stopping doing wholesale things, not little salami slicing here and there, but actually things that the government does at the present and perhaps has done for several years, no longer being done in order to send that money elsewhere.
And we should say, we know the overall, they call it the envelope, don't they? Which is the total amount. It's not the piece of paper on which they do the calculations. It's the total amount that the government is prepared to spend overall in each of these years. It's just the allocations to the individual departments that is now being negotiated.
And that's where these things get tough, because it's one thing for Keir Starmer to give speeches, as he did last week, talking about what the government's priorities are. And we're told that bids for funding essentially will be looked upon more kindly if they are or feed into one of Keir Starmer's priorities, one of the government's priorities. But the corollary of that is that other things aren't priorities. And so if you're funding the priorities, then almost by definition, you are defunding the things that aren't priorities. And that's where things get controversial. And remember, almost all of these ministers are new to all of this. In the run-up to the budget in the autumn, we saw pretty heated, mostly private, but occasionally spilling out into public view, pretty heated negotiations. You had a few cabinet ministers who went over Rachel Reeves' head to Keir Starmer to say that they needed more money than the Chancellor was willing to give them. Now, that was just for a one-year settlement. Now we're talking about 3 years. You can see these things getting fraught. So, I said all the stuff about this shaping how the state looks and what the state does, and obviously that's the most important thing. But it also, I think, will, over the coming months, bit by bit, become one of those Westminster dramas where you will find out which ministers are cheesed off, which ministers are being preferred, who's up, who's down, all of that. I think this spending review is really going to shape what the kind of court politics of Westminster looks like over the early part of 2025.
And there's that amazing / awful phrase, shroud waving.
I've never heard that.
You
phrase.
must have done.
No, I honestly haven't.
Civil servants love it. No, so it's this idea that shroud waving is when, a government minister sort of leaks to a newspaper that, if my department doesn't get X billion pounds, all the lights will go off. Or
isn't that
all
kite flying?
NHS
No, I
dentists
guess
will
kite flying is a
will
policy.
never be able to work on a Friday or a Thursday ever again. Give me some more billions. That's called shroud waving.
Oh, I'm
Can't
going to
believe
use
I've
that on
educated you. Wow, that's a turn up.
I genuinely don't think I've ever heard that before. What's a shroud?
I'm just checking I
when it's
haven't
at
made it
home?
up. Let me just check I haven't made it up.
No, I'm sure you haven't.
Shroud waving. Oh, the practice of focusing on the potentially negative effects of a particular policy in order to influence public opinion.
That is exactly what you said.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Shroud-waving. It's hyphenated. It's not two words. Just in terms of your future use on
I'm
the
off
radio.
to meet a government minister. I'm going to ask them about whether they intend to wave any shrouds.
Well, it's a good way of getting a story out of them. You're very welcome. Henry, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.